Welcome to this video supporting Chapter 12 of my iOS Development for Absolute Beginners book. In this video, you'll take a look at building an application that works on the iPad, as well as all those that we've been doing for the iPhone. So let's get started by creating a new Xcode project. Let's do something a little different this time. Instead of creating a single view application, we'll create a master detail application. Let's call it characters. And for devices, let's create an iPad application. We could create Universal, which does both iPad and iPhone, but just to keep it simple, I'm going to create it as an iPad. Press next and you'll see the familiar put it on the desktop, and just make sure that your source control is unchecked and your application will be created. We see a few more things now than you'd normally see. We have our app delegate, but instead of the view controller, we have the master view controller and the detail view controller. We'll look at them in a moment. But first we'll go to our main.storyboard and we'll see that the main.storyboard is also a lot more sophisticated than what we used to. So the main.storyboard deals with, there's a master view for navigation, and then whenever you select an item in the master view, it takes you to the details for that view. It's probably easier to show rather than to tell. So let me launch it. So here's my application, and it's running in portrait mode right now. So I just have my detail view here, and if I click on master, then I get my master menu. If I rotate the device to the left, we'll see the more familiar view of like the column on the left, and it's like the email application on your iPad. So this column with the detail, or with the master entries, and then the client area on the right with the details. If I press plus here, we can see I'm creating more master items, and when I select them, I see the detail for that item. So think about it very much like the email application on your iPad. But let's customize this now so that we add our own content to the master. So say we have items here that we're going to add, and when we select those items, we navigate and get different content here. In much the same way as, like I say, if it was an email, this might be an email item from somebody, and when you select it, you see the body text of that mail. But we're going to do it by doing like a little graphical browser of different characters. So let's take a look at how we would do that. So we'll start by going to the storyboard and looking at the detail view. So if I zoom in on it, if you remember earlier, when we selected an item, then we saw the detail view for that item, and then the detail view was just the contents of that item. And if I look inside the view, we can see the label itself that just says detail view content goes here. So something was changing this content based on when I selected something in the master view. So if I look at the code for the detail view and the detail view controller, I can see that the outlet has been created for me for the detail description label. And in its actual implementation code, there's this function, set detail item, new detail item is in there, and this actually creates and sets the detail items text. But how does this get called? And we need to take a look at how this works by looking at the master controller itself. And the other thing to take note of is in the view did load, we do the self configure view call, and self configure view says if the detail item has something in it, if it's not null, so the set detail item has done something, then the detail description label.text will become the detail item's description. But again, to see how that happens, we need to look at the master view controller. And in the master view controller, we have the familiar table view. And if we look at the master view controller, we can see that it uses the UI table view. So another way of doing it that we haven't seen yet, as well as delegates, is that our master view controller can inherit from something called a table view controller. And as a result, it gets all the goodies without us explicitly coding it. But if I go down into the master view controller.m, we can start seeing some of the familiar functions like the number of sections in table view and the number of rows in the section. So when the user selects an item in the master table view, this happens. We have an NSDate object which becomes the object. So our data is stored in this objects array, much the same as we had with the soccer teams in an earlier video, and we pull the index path.row from that. So then that date we will set to be the detail item for the detail view controller. So as the detail view controller loads for the detail, this object gets passed to it, and this object is a date. So now when I'm in the detail view controller, I can see that set detail item has been called, this object has been passed into me as a date. And when I configure view, then if it exists, then I'm just going to set the detail item, which was that label's description, to, sorry, the detail description label its text will be set to the description of the detailed item, and as a result that date will get rendered in there. So we can piggyback off of this code to create code ourselves for the characters browser. So let's see how we're going to do that. First of all, we'll go into the master view controller, and in the master view controller we're going to create our own data source. So instead of this NS mutable array objects being populated by random dates whenever the user pressed the plus button, I'm just going to create my own set of items that go into that. So for example, I'm going to change this code so that I don't do any of this. And I'm just going to say objects equals an NS mutable array alloc. And I'm going to initialize it with a set of objects. And these objects are going to be my objects. So I'm going to just use strings. So I'm going to, Finton, Zach, Ayako, Nishani, Sinclair, and Iara, and end it with nil because the array has to be null terminated. Okay, and now my self detail view controller star, that all looks good. I don't need to change anything. So let's see what happens if I run the application now. It's going to look a little different, but not a whole lot. So now instead of the list of and me adding random times and dates to the list, I have the list of strings that I put in there. And when I select them, you see that the detail has been passed over so that the detail view is now showing the name. So it's Finton, Zach, Yako, or whatever. Sorry if it's a little small in the video, but I can try to zoom in. See if you can see it a little better. There we go. Like so. And if I rotate it so that we're in portrait mode, we get the same thing. And the functionality that iPad gives you where you select the master and then it zooms out, it slides out when you're done. Okay, so now we have our characters listed there. So what are we going to do with them? Let's have a little bit more fun than just putting a string in here. Okay, we'll start by generating a URI out of this string. So if I go back to my detail view controller.m, and when I'm looking at my self detail item update here in configure view, instead of it just being a text, you know, the description with the name, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that name into a URL. Now earlier I had done something. Let me show you a browser window. I had uploaded and created, if I go to iOS7 developer.com/book/ for example ayako.jpg, I should get a graphic for Ayako, and there it is. So what I have done was that I have these graphics in there with the name of the graphic. The file name is the same as the name of the character itself. So while I pass Finton to the detail view, or Nishani or Ayako to the detail view, I can now use that to create a URI to this actual image. So how would I do that? So let's take a look here. So if self detail item is set, I should do something like NS string, image address is a new NS string, string with format, and the URL that we saw earlier was http://iOS7 developer.com/book/ a string.jpg, and we can say a string.jpg like this, and then we replace that %@ character with the name of the character by saying what was self.detail item description, like so. I can get rid of this sidebar so we can see all the code properly. So now I have an image address from that one, and I can use this image address. And first of all, actually, I want to turn it into a lowercase string. Some web servers are case sensitive, so I just want to make sure that everything is lowercase. Like Linux-based web servers tend to be case sensitive. So now I have that lowercase string, and now I can set the label to that. So if I now run my application, let's see what it looks like. So now as I browse my characters, oh, it's not working. What have I done wrong? Of course. I had created this image address out of everything, but then when I set the detailed labeled text, I should set it to image address. So now if I run my app, we should see the URL. And there we go. So the URL is in there. So now can we use this URL to load a picture? Why not? So how would we do this? Okay, let's go to our detail view controller again, and we'll take a look at it on the storyboard. So here's our detail view controller, and we had our text as you saw there. So why don't we add an image control to this? I'm just going to drag that out of the way. And we can add an image control by using the UI image view. So if I search here for image, let me just size things a little differently so that we have a bit more screen real estate to work in. Whoops. Guess I should bring that back. And I'm going to drop my image view on here and try and size it out. It'll take a little bit of experimentation to get it right, but that should do the trick. So I now need to create an outlet for this image so that I can refer to it in my code. So I'm going to open the assistant, close this guy, and I'm going to make sure the assistant is on detailviewcontroller.h, and I'll create an outlet, and I'll call that outlet img character picture. So now in my code, if I go back to my detailviewcontroller.m, I now know the URL that I want. I now know the URL of the image. So can I take that URL and turn that into a picture? Well, let's see. So I have the image address. So all I should have to do is say NSURL star URL is, I'm going to create a new URL with that string, as we saw in the web views chapter. URL with string, and give it the image address. So I now have a URL of that address, and I can use that URL to do something. Now there's an object called NSData, which is used to download binary data, and image data is binary data. So I can call this image data, and I have to call it, and I allocate a new NSData, and I'm going to init with the contents of the URL. Init with contents of URL right there, and my URL was called just simply URL. So this is downloading the contents of that URL, which was binary data, which is the graphic, and putting it into this image data. So my image I called image character picture. I can now set its internal image to be a new object called a UI image. And a UI image can be initialized with data by saying image with data. And there's my NSData, and I just called it image data, like this. So now that should go off to the web and download the image and load it into that UI image control. So let's run it and see what happens. So now it runs, and if I select my character, there we can see their graphic representing them. Downloaded off of the web. Pretty cool, huh? And if I rotate the hardware, we should see that it still works. And in this case now we have the URL of the image underneath it, when it was in the other aspect ratio that was cropped off the bottom of the screen. So that's it. That's how to build a simple iPad application that uses the master detail view. It's a very powerful application pattern. You'd probably see it in a lot of iOS applications. And I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to seeing the iPad applications that you build.